I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And today we're talking about The Thin Blue Line, another BBC sitcom from our childhood, and the third that we've talked about this year, starring Rowan Atkinson. The Thin Blue Line was a police sitcom, as you may be able to tell from the title, and it aired in two series in the latter stages of 1995 and 1996. Which I've always found quite memorable because we were in two different houses for the two different series. And it's really the only thing I can remember people discussing and enjoying and laughing about what was said on it at school. Whenever you would read things like back issues of the Quest newsletter about Nightmare, fans would write in and say, oh, we all used to talk about it at school. I never used to hear people talking about TV programmes, really, and comparing notes each week on TV programmes at school, except The Thin Blue Line, when I was in Year 8, which is when the first series was on, and a lot of people aged about 12 or 13 seemed to rather enjoy it, and I think it does appeal to a very broad audience, and I can see why it was being laughed about and talked about under those circumstances. We enjoyed it very much when we were young tweens or teens, and do very much now. It's not one of those things you really enjoy on a different level when you're older, I don't think. It's just very accessible. The two series have really 7 episodes each. The first series, End Of, is a Christmas special, which aired slightly apart from the rest of the series, but to all intents and purposes, there's 7 episodes each, so it's rather like Fawlty Towers, in that it has 2 rather high-quality series. Of course, The Thin Blue Line does have those 2 extra episodes overall on Fawlty Towers, and didn't ever make the mistake of trying to come back and keep it funny, when obviously it wasn't going to be sustainable past that point. And that is a good way to leave a series being remembered fondly and always being very good and very funny, rather than something you come and watch and say, oh, I remember how good this used to be, which is a very wise decision when they're brave enough to make it. I was quite surprised at first, I guess, in 1997 when The Thin Blue Line didn't come back. I was expecting them to churn out a few more series, as they usually would do with things at BBC. But very wisely, they didn't, and so we can look back and watch the DVD of the whole thing and enjoy it very much. And indeed, it's true that in Series 2 it does rather run out of steam in many ways. Definitely the right place to stop. As we were discussing while watching the DVDs recently, it's really what Rowan Atkinson did between Mr. Bean TV episodes and Bean the movie, and he does get the opportunity to channel some of Mr. Bean and his physical comedy into the lead character of The Thin Blue Line, Inspector Raymond Fowler, and also he draws on his Blackadder experiences quite a lot and channels quite a bit of Blackadder into Inspector Fowler as well. I read a blurb for The Thin Blue Line on UK Gold, it's not called that anymore, but I think it was at the time, saying that Rowan Atkinson stars as the bumbling Inspector Fowler, and we were moved to have a small conversation about how inaccurate that was. He's not bumbling like Mr. Bean, neither is he quite like Blackadder in every way, charismatically, slyly acerbic, for example. But in many ways, he's kind of a mesh of the two, and in many ways, he's quite unique as well, but still an excellent showcase for Rowan Atkinson's talents. I guess you would describe Inspector Fowler as old-fashioned, an old-fashioned policeman, an old-fashioned gentleman, perhaps a little out of touch in some ways with the modern world, but actually very shrewd, very on the ball, and very much someone to rely on as a main character to bring the show to a kind of conclusion that we'll be wanting as viewers.
What makes him very unlike Blackadder is that he's a good person, isn't it? Blackadder's not a good person at all. But what makes him kind of like Blackadder is that he's sometimes a bit rude to his fellow police officers. Particularly Constable Goody. He's rude to him just because he's thick and annoying and makes some unnecessary comments like, your head is just somewhere to put your hat, isn't it comfortable, which is the kind of thing you'd hear from Blackadder.
The sorts of things he might say to Baldric. And when he's telling all of them that they haven't engaged with his briefing properly, you started this briefing completely unprepared for what we've got to go out and do, and you've ended the briefing slightly less prepared than that. And that's very Blackadder-like, particularly the way he delivers it. So I think he certainly does the right thing at times like that, channeling Blackadder into the character. When it was first on, I used to think and say, well, this is kind of like Blackadder 5, really. It's created and written by Ben Elton, one of the two main Blackadder writers from Series 2 onwards. And like in Blackadder, Ben Elton has a cameo in it at one point. And I did feel that Inspector Fowler was like Blackadder in many ways. I didn't really think about it fully and analyse it properly like we're doing now, but particularly the way he would call Patricia, his partner and sergeant, Darling, in the funny way that he would call Captain Darling on Blackadder, Sergeant Darling. I thought that was very much taken directly over from Blackadder Goes Forth. And indeed some of the actual jokes are reused from Blackadder. I can think of one off the top of my head about rough shag as a tobacco and a double entendre. And I think there are other lines inspired by Blackadder jokes, if not exactly lifted directly from it. So it certainly has a Blackadder vibe about it, and that's certainly no bad thing.
An interesting thing you found out was that they kind of wanted Chris Barry for the role at first, and I suspect that he jumped to mind because of his performance of Gordon Prittis in the British Empire. He really is bumbling, isn't he? So perhaps had he played the role, Inspector Fowler would also have turned out to be bumbling.
He needs that Blackadder edge, really, to stop him being someone we laugh at ever as a person. When he does get to do his Mr. Bean, it's things that Blackadder wouldn't do when he comes in drunk and does his funny taking off his trousers sequence all over the bedroom. That's just the way Mr. Bean might take off his trousers. And when he pretends to be an alien police officer for the briefing about tolerance, that's Rowan Atkinson using his physical comedy in a way that is much more reminiscent of Mr. Bean than Blackadder.
And what's funny about that sequence is that the character, Raymond, is doing it absolutely seriously as proper police work, but everyone knows it's funny that he's coming in pretending to be this alien. I think it's the most kind of out there Raymond does for his policing job. He doesn't normally do that kind of thing, but he thinks it's going to help his officers with their anti-racism.
And that is something from Series 2, and it does go to show how had it continued, they probably would have pushed things like that too far, and as I say, it was the right time to end. One very consistent character trait of Raymond's is doing the right thing, doing things by the book, standing up for what's right. He comes up with some very good quotes for the police to live by in that sort of area. Better a criminal walk free than the police become criminals themselves. It's not the job of the police to provoke people to break the law.
Their job is to enforce the law, not to enforce the law if we happen to think it's a nice one.
That's another good one. But of course, he's not the complete stick in the mud that would make us hate the character, and he comes up with a little scheme to stop PC Habib being charged after she's protected her little sister from having drugs discovered on her.
The other thing that's kind of like that is where Goody has punched the racist, fascist, handcuffed youth for calling Habib the P word, and then Raymond's saying, well, I can't do anything because the boy's mother is pressing charges, and then they're in his office, the boy and his mother, and she starts hitting him and saying, you talk to him, and smacking him round the head, and Raymond says, I'm going to charge you with assault, or we could just forget the whole thing. And it occurred to me as we were watching it this time, that wouldn't at all be seen as the right thing now, would it? He lets Goody off off hitting a child and he lets the mother off hitting her child. That's not really right at all by today's standards, but I suppose in the 90s we were okay with seeing a very large, very racist, unpleasant, practically grown-up child being hit by various people, but he was technically a minor.
And the other really big aspect of Raymond's character and role in the show, of course, is, as I mentioned, his relationship with Sergeant Patricia Dawkins, and it's very central to the show in many ways. It's a relationship that has its 10-year anniversary, and it's rather stagnated in many ways. They have problems with their sex life, and Raymond is a bit of a stick in the mud about talking about sex, and they've perhaps got into a bit of a rut where they don't really appreciate each other physically and emotionally like they used to. And it's good at the end of series 2 to see them coming back together and learning to appreciate each other again and renewing their relationship, because you know they're not going to be happy unless they are together. But they do get a lot of comedy out of it along the way. In many ways, I think Patricia is a very positive female character. She has a very healthy attitude towards sex and its place in a healthy relationship. And she could come across as kind of a whining, nagging nympho if they weren't careful about it. Of course, men always tend to write women in that way anyway, rather, don't they? But I think Serena Evans manages to stop that happening with her performance. I think that's rather well done.
Of course, there are in her character symptoms of a woman being written by male writers, like her being jealous of the mayoress and spitting on the biscuit she's going to bring her, and when she's crying and Raymond's saying, "What's the matter?" she's saying, "Nothing, really, it's nothing," and not meaning it, which I don't think is really something a lot of women do.
She really is the most unprofessional character in the whole thing. She's in a position of some responsibility at the station, and she's always letting those petty jealousies that men write for her affect her work. Like, how does it go? "Sergeant, why did you let this inebriate pass the front desk?" "Because he's a sad, pathetic excuse for a man, and I thought you'd get on." I mean, really, that's terribly unprofessional, but quite funny.
Yes, I think that's the furthest that she goes with her unprofessionalism. She spits on the mayoress's biscuits and picks up the phone with the mayoress on it, supposedly, although she's not there, and says, "Hello, Dame Christabel, you're a stuck-up tart." But of course that scene with the drunk just randomly turning up at the briefing leads to a very funny sequence, because he's sick in Raymond's hat, which Raymond then puts on when...
I think an assistant commissioner, a high-up officer from the Met anyway, who's come along to liaise.
When he's come along, Raymond forgets, puts on his hat, and it doesn't sound funny. It sounds very silly and not particularly original. But Rowan Atkinson makes it hilarious the way he says, "Oh my God, my hat's full of sick." And then he's going to talk to this character who I always call Lord Ashfordley, because I recognise him as Lord Ashfordley from Heartbeat, and he plays that kind of posh, somewhat aggressive character in a lot of things. And he is demanding, "Don't you remove your hat in the presence of a senior officer?" And Raymond says, "No, sir, I am a Sikh. I am forbidden to bare my head." And in the way he says it, it's just so funny, because Rowan Atkinson is actually a genius.
And that's certainly an example of a unique Inspector Fowler kind of scene in comedy, where he's not channeling Blackadder or Mr. Bean in any way. Of course, Lord Ashfordley, Rupert Van Sittar, appeared in Mr. Bean a few times.
He was that beefeater, wasn't he, who Mr. Bean was decorating.
And let's talk about Inspector Grim. It was played by David Haig, and in many ways I think he's the most kind of caricaturish character in the show. I've read criticism of the show saying, "Oh, it's all about caricatures, they're not really like real people." And I say, well, they're as real as they need to be for the comedy and the premise, and it works really, really well. I think the realist is probably P.C. Habib, and I think perhaps the most caricature-ish is Detective Inspector Derek Grimm, but he's absolutely hilarious. He wishes he was John Thorne the Sweeney or something like that. He wants to be a very cool, thief-taking, hard detective, but he doesn't really get the opportunity in Gasforth, and it doesn't really suit him as a character either, but nevertheless he's always striving to achieve that kind of air about him, which is very funny in itself, and he just does some absolute comedy gold, doesn't he?
Yes, when I was young, even I used to enjoy his megalophores, which is a word I read meaning wrong metaphors. He's slippery like an owl. Lock him up and throw away the door, and that kind of thing. It used to make me laugh a lot and still does.
I love one word. Organised crime. And he doesn't really realise he's doing it, but it's always delivered so well, and it's hilarious.
A man walks into a bar and he says ouch because it's a public bar. I mean an iron bar. That is a joke. And he's funny like when the TV crew are there and they're driving around in the car and absolutely nothing's happening, so he's doing a crackly voice pretending there's someone on the radio saying there's knife crime or something, I can't remember now, saying to Mark Addy as Boyle, let's go, go, go. And Mark Addy turns around and says, go where, sir? Because he hasn't said where it's supposed to be.
Inspector Grimm's interactions with Inspector Fowler are always rather good to watch, I think. Grimm would like to cut a lot of corners that Raymond doesn't approve of. And then, of course, when Raymond comes to him and says, look, Derek, let's just let Tracy Habib off this drugs charge. And then Grimm gets very, well, high and mighty Inspector Fowler. But really, Grimm has a lot of professional respect for Fowler, more than he'd like to admit. But sometimes he does admit it. He showed a lot of bottle Fowler and stuff like that.
Yes, and of course, he does get a bit of character development and some more depth in that one where they plant evidence of drugs, and that's another thing, isn't it, where Raymond finds a way around it. Goody's made the arrest, not in his official uniform, so the case is declared void, and then Grimm, who's been somewhat reluctant to do this drugs plant, but really wants to get the criminal because he knows that he is a drug dealer, starts having a go at Fowler and calling him hoity-toity, namby-pamby, all that kind of stuff that he does, and then suddenly starts crying and saying, I'm sorry, Raymond.
I'm glad you stopped it. Yeah, that's good stuff. He can certainly come across as a real character, a real person, as real as he needs to, as he ever so calls for it.
There's nothing lower than a bent copper, he says, so he also has some principles and does take his job as a policeman seriously enough, although, as you say, he really wants to be in the Sweeney and stuff. He wants the water cooler, so as Raymond says, he can strut about with a paper cup in his hand like an American policeman.
And you mentioned there Mark Addy as Detective Constable Boyle, who is Grimm's sidekick, as it were, in Series 2. I always used to say I didn't like him much as a character, and I much preferred Detective Constable Cray in the first series. And this was really Mark Addy's big break in many ways. After the Thin Blue Line, everyone seemed to want to put him in everything, like the Full Monty, and then he's in loads of Hollywood movies afterwards. But I always thought, I prefer it without him, really. But what I do think is interesting about Boyle is the couple of times where he is the devil on Grimm's shoulder, and you've mentioned the drug planting thing, which Boyle really leads. And because they decided to begin Series 2 with that episode, it always kind of left me with the impression of, Boyle's not very nice, he's a bent copper, but actually he's not so bad in the rest of the series. But the other time he's the devil on Grimm's shoulder is where he's tempting him into the illegal pub lock-in, the Copper's Perk. And of course Raymond ends up using that information to have something over Grimm so that PC Habib won't be charged with the drugs thing. Raymond doing what he believes is right rather than what's legally right.
Very comical, isn't it, when they're trying to escape out of the toilet window, an old copper's trick, and Raymond's sitting there on the toilet with all his trousers and everything on, he's not doing anything there, and he's saying, What's the trouble with old Copper's tricks, Constable Boyle? Old coppers know 'em.
Exactly, and that goes to show he is a shrewd old copper, really. He's not a bumbling inspector at all. He just chooses his moments, and they're very effective for it. I was saying at one point I didn't think Gary Boyle, that's his full name, had any redeeming qualities. He was just nasty and boorish and laddish and uncouth and used for laughs in that way.
And he is that to a large extent, to be fair.
But you were spotting some bits where you saw, well, he's okay, he has a human side, he cares about the people who work with him at the police station, really.
Yes, he's quite keen to try and cheer up Raymond and take him out on the pull after Pat breaks up with him. And he does look concerned that time Pat comes in saying she's been mugged, but actually she's talking about her aerobics instructor making her all stiff.
And he does usually help out Grimm with his cases properly, not being a bent copper. But as I say, he replaced Detective Constable Robert Cray from Season 1, who was played by Kevin Allen. And I didn't always prefer Cray. I thought he was funnier, really. And he is very funny with his brash ways, but he's not unpleasantly brash, unlike Boyle. He's just rather amusingly brash.
It does mean that Boyle has more to contribute to the plot, I think, whereas Cray really is just there as Grimm's sidekick and for laughs.
Yes, perhaps Cray is more of a construct than Boyle. But I do enjoy always watching Cray with his funny takeaway orders when he's supposed to be doing police work on the phones and pushing in at the bank, and his escapades with being on Raymond's quiz team for the pub quiz. I guess I just find him funnier than Boyle, and in a sitcom I think that's why I enjoy watching him more than Boyle. Obviously they made a decision to replace him with a kind of more real, more rounded character for Season 2. I suppose I can understand why they did that, but I don't think it was strictly necessary.
What does he say that's very funny? There's that bit where Grimm's doing this whole speech with him, like on TV, cops tell my wife I love her and stuff if I don't make it, which I think he probably will under the circumstances, won't he? And he's saying, see that she wants for nothing or something, and Cray turns around and goes, what do you mean, give her one? And completely steps on the atmosphere Grimm wants to create there, and then he's saying, is there anything I can do for you? And he says, well, I've got a couple of videos out, so you can take them back for me.
See, I think unlike Boyle with that kind of conversation, there's no kind of trying to take the piss or be nasty in Cray. He's just a bit sort of clueless.
I like the bit where Grimm is telling him about how he's going to be in the pantomime. He's got the role that Raymond wanted, Captain Hook, and he's practicing with the pantomime through the whole episode, which is funny. It's a Christmas episode. But he's telling Cray about it in the pub, and Cray stuffing his face with a burger or something. Grimm says to him, the director said I was a suppressed thespian. Cray says, blimey, I'd have smacked him in the mouth. Which is very funny, the way he delivers that line. And yes, when I was young, what I chiefly remembered about him was that he was always ordering pizza and kebabs and stuff on the police phone.
I don't know, perhaps that would have run out of steam in Season 2 and I'd have said, oh, Cray got a bit old. But as it was, he left me wanting more after the first season. Let's talk about PC Frank Gladstone next, because there's not a tremendous amount to say, I don't think. He was played by Rudolph Walker, who also appeared in Mr. Bean, the very first episode of Mr. Bean, and has, at the time of recording this podcast, been on EastEnders for about 18 years, and in many ways is a very entertaining actor to watch.
I was saying that Cray doesn't have much to contribute to the plot, but he does go about with Grimm doing police work. You really don't see Frank doing any police work, except he's the one barging into the pub lock-in and arresting everybody, and that's really about the only actual contribution he has to make to a plot, I think. He just hangs about the police station, chipping in with amusing comments.
He's the one who used to get quoted when people would say what they found funny. When I was in year 8 at school, people would come in and say, isn't it funny to say he's had a phone call about someone trimming the hedge into the shape of a bottom, and they were all very keen on the elephant impression that Frank tells them how to do, silly boys in my year 8 class.
I never found that very funny, I'm afraid.
I think he is someone who runs out of steam by the end of series 2, because when you get to the final few episodes, you can tell exactly what his funny story is going to consist of and exactly what the punchline is going to be, even before he started telling the funny story. You think, oh yes, this situation, this setup is going to lead to Frank telling this funny story, and then he does.
And they end up being all about his wife, don't they? The first one, I think it's the first one about his wife, is funny, where he was being firm with her, saying, I'm going to go for a drink if I want, I expect my dinner on the table when I get back, and Kevin Goody, I think, says, that work did it? And he says, I don't know, I never saw her again, which is very funny. But then, yes, it's all flying saucer in the kitchen, and you're like, okay, so the wife's thrown a saucer at him, that's very obvious. And then there are other funny stories too that aren't about his wife earlier on, like being in the pub quiz team and telling the team the important things of memory, and detail. And did you win? I don't know, I forgot where the pub was, and that kind of thing. But yes, it becomes all about his ex-wife and very predictable.
I suppose perhaps if he had disappeared for series 2 like Cray did, I would say, oh, I wanted to see more of both of them in series 2. But in truth, he had about the same legs as Cray for being funny, and series 2 really showed that off. And the other two uniformed constables who we've mentioned, Kevin Goody and Maggie Habib, really are very strong, very central characters in the show, and a lot of the action and themes and conversation revolves around them. If you were making a cast in order of prevalence, as the first series of Blackadder might put it, you'd probably stick them in after Inspector Fowler, really.
They get to be on the front of the DVD with him, don't they, those two?
Yeah, that's it. I think it would be Inspector Fowler, and then those two, and then Pat, and then Inspector Grimm, and then Frank, and then the DC.
Do you think maybe Boyle might go before Frank series 2?
Even bump him down.
I think that's possible.
Poor old Frank. Perhaps in that case it was best to keep it alphabetical so nobody was upset. Of course, it means the two DCs always go directly after Inspector Fowler, which is quite neat, because they're Alan and Addy, which both come before Anwar, Mina Anwar, who played PC Habib. So we've left Goody and Habib to the end to talk about, but that's not to say that they're not prevalent, because, as I was saying, they are.
When I was a child, Kevin was always my favourite because his humour is very accessible.
You know, I think, like Frank, he does kind of run out of steam by the end of series 2. And as you always say, and you're quite right, James Dreyfus very much camps up his performance throughout series 2. And perhaps goes a bit far with it.
Yes, I mean, he's kind of a camp actor anyway, so Goody comes across camp-ish. But then when he's just saying quite ordinary things like wondering why William the Conqueror was called William, everyone else in his army was called Norman, it just comes across more camp and kind of feminine than it needs to. And I think, personally, that makes it less funny. If you're doing camp humour for a joke that's not camp, it's not really going to work.
I agree. I think he's falling back too much on that aspect that people have enjoyed when it's been used appropriately, and thus it gets overdone. I mean, he's particularly funny in the first episode they showed, which, as it's easy to work out, isn't supposed to be the first episode in order. Just like series 2, they led with what they thought would be a good episode to start with. And it is a good episode to start with, Rag Week. But I can't see the queues in the supermarket without thinking about Kevin and his advice about queues in the bank. I should swap queues, I'm going to swap queues, one of us could swap queues and save a place. Oh, no, we could put a bag in each queue. He does that all so funny. And of course it's very fresh at the time. And again, another series of that sort of thing played to extremes wouldn't have been very welcome, I don't think.
What did he used to do to make me laugh when they're having one of their briefings, which they only have a couple of, don't they, in series 1, and then they realise they're so funny they have to have a long, extended comedy briefing with funny costumes, alien impressions, riot gear, etc. And there's one where Raymond's pretending to be the defence lawyer at the drugs trial where the drugs were planted, and Kevin found them. And Raymond's having a go at him, telling him he's lying and stuff, and he keeps crying. That was very funny for me as a child.
I like in that bit, Raymond can't get him to understand the concept of pretending to be himself in another time and place until Goody can relate it to, like, the X-Files, which is a nice bit of pop culture reference that was very much in the soup at the time and is very much the sort of thing you do see on the X-Files. One of the main characters is themselves, but in another time and place, but not in the same way as pretending to be at a trial.
Yes, we had a good laugh when there was some X-Files on TV on demand or something, and the blurb said Mulder is on a World War II submarine, and we were laughing and saying, oh, he's himself in another time and place.
That's really true.
Of course, a very funny sequence, again from the Christmas one, is where he's accidentally given Raymond the lingerie he intended for Maggie, and Raymond takes him into his office, and he's all embarrassed at the stuff. I'm not remotely embarrassed, he says, and he obviously is, and then he's asking, do you find me attractive? And Goody just kind of doesn't know what to say, and he says, oh, well, I don't know, sir. Your eyes are very clean. I think that's nice.
That always makes me think how in Series 2 it's obvious that it is going to become kind of forced and stale if they do another series, because they kind of recreate that scene where Raymond is trying to be supportive when he thinks Goody is going to come out as a homosexual. The coming out really is coming out for an illegal drink. And I always think that is exactly the same kind of scene interaction between the two of them, with Raymond being awkward, but it doesn't make quite as much sense in the context of the episode, and it's not quite as funny.
Of course, I've just mentioned Kevin intending to give Maggie lingerie for Christmas, and one of the kind of running gags is that he really, really fancies her. But it's one of those ones where it's totally unrequited, and I don't find those very good to watch, because the one who is doing the fancying just becomes a kind of a sex pest for the one who's not interested. You can't hope that they'll get together and follow their progress.
I always used to find that rather disappointing.
At no stage do you get the sense that Maggie might reciprocate, I don't think. She's grateful to him for punching the person who called her a P-word, but it doesn't make her want him in a romantic or sexual sense.
She's very fond of him in a way that she would like him to get over her and get on with the rest of his life, which does mean that his persistent pursuing of her doesn't come across very well, really. They probably should have abandoned it for Series 2 and accepted that they couldn't really get any more viable humour out of it and just have them be funny in other ways, because they are.
We can talk about Maggie now, I think, and when I was a child, I used to find her a bit boring compared to the others, because she doesn't have as much comedy, but actually Mina Anwar can be funny when the occasion calls for it, like in the one where she fancies Gary, the fireman, and she's going all silly about him and saying, Pat, this is Gary, his name's Gary, and then asking him if he wants to come in. I've got a packet of biscuits. So when she's not being funny, it's because the role and the situation that she's in doesn't call for it. And as you were saying, she's probably the most real character. Kind of like people like Polly in Fawlty Towers and that woman who was the teacher in Chalk. Normal person going into this rather bizarre, surreal world.
Nicola Walker, that's the actress. I can't remember what the character was called in Chalk. But yeah, that's very much based on a kind of real person in a world of caricatures. Yes, I think Maggie does play that role a lot.
And of course she's very kind of PC, as they term it, isn't she? Quite sort of progressive, wanting equality between the sexes, between the races and religions, and she really cares about justice, and she enforces the law to protect people, rather than like Grimm to go around arresting people. She really cares about the people that she's saving rather than the people that they're putting away and all that kind of thing. And you see her doing what WPCs were originally invented for back in the Dark Ages, to put their arm around crying women and that kind of thing, and being supportive of people.
the sort of thing they'll be used for in the shows that Grimm wishes he was part of. Oh, there's a crying woman, slap her, and if that doesn't work, get a WPC to comfort her.
And what I'm really thinking about now is the one where she does withhold evidence of drugs that she finds on her little sister. It makes her even more human, real, and then she's distressed because it looks like her career is going to be over. So I suppose she goes to some extreme. She can be a complete comedy character, like in that scene with Gary, and she can be very, very real.
In many ways, she kind of anchors Raymond and Derek Grimm to the real world when they're interacting with her and talking about her. They both kind of respect her as an officer with a great career ahead of her. That bit where they're talking about, let's not charge her for the drugs, we have to charge her for the drugs. What does Grimm say? I don't like it, but we're charging her.
Then with the illegal lock-in, Grimm saying, this is going to be the end of my career, Raymond says, oh, never mind, Derek, it was never a very promising one, unlike Constable Habib's, grounding that quite comical scene in reality there. But when you were talking about trying to kind of recreate that Do You Find Me Attractive scene with Goody, it reminded me of how they do the same kind of thing with Habib. The funny one that I was reminded of was when Raymond was telling her that she was going to be essentially a honey trap. I don't think he uses that term at that point in the episode, although it is used. You're going to be seconded to the Criminal Investigations Department, and then they have this whole conversation about initials CID, and he tells her to dress up in her finest stockings, mini skirt and boob tube, and she's finding it all a bit bizarre that he's saying these things, and then he goes, I envy you, Constable Habib. And he doesn't mean he wants to dress up like a tart. He means that he envies the duty that she's doing as a police officer. And then in series 2, right at the very end, for no particular reason, it's not got to do with the plot, they're just trying to create some comedy and recreate that particular comedy. He calls Habib into his office to ask her advice about proposing to Pat, and they end up having this conversation about an AIDS test, and I never found that funny myself.
Oh yes, that ends up with that herpes the gonorrhea thing, doesn't it?
Yes.
Which I always thought was a less funny version of the joke that they kind of got away with because it was quite original Roger Ring in the first series.
It also reminds me of Great Booze Up Edmund in Blackadder 2, which is the original and the funny version of that joke.
So really, all the characters are very good and very entertaining and as funny and as caricaturish as they need to be at various times. And that's why the show works so well. Some of them, I think it's true, do completely run out of steam by the end of Series 2. But Series 2 is definitely worth doing and watching. It's still very funny, but as I say, you can see that yes, it is the right place to stop. You mentioned Raymond's proposal to Patricia there, which always strikes me, takes me on a bit of a journey, because you know that she would absolutely love to say yes to Raymond proposing to her because he wants to propose to her, and he set up all this lovely meal, and he starts to do his speech, and she's really quite excited about it, and you think, oh, well, yeah, okay, he's going to get away with this up to the point where he says he wants them to grow old and flabby together, and Patricia's obviously like, oh, well, that's not very romantic, but I suppose it's quite sweet, and I think, yes, he's going to get away with it up to that point. And then he mentions the promotions review board, and we're all like, oh, no. And it's quite clever, really, because it makes sense for him as a character and for their relationship for this scene to be unfolding as it is. And we feel it, don't we? And we think, oh, what a shame. Oh, if only he'd done it properly, she'd have been happy to accept. I hope they get back together by the end of the episode. And of course they do, and that's the happy ending. But that just goes to show we care about them that much as characters and as a couple by that final episode. They can't have been too caricaturish all the way through. We've been on that journey with them. So the Thin Blue Line, in my opinion, definitely deserves its place on my list of my very favourite BBC sitcoms, along with Blackadder, Fawlty Towers, which I'm sure we'll podcast about sometime next year, Red Dwarf,
I think they're definitely the top 4, aren't they? And then there are other good ones like The Vicar of Dibley.
Only Fools and Horses, at least in a lot of them. Had some real peaks and troughs, that one. And perhaps those two are things we'll podcast about someday. But for the moment, there's an end to our podcast on the Thin Blue Line. Hopefully you'll join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in November, for a podcast on
Thundercats. Getting back to 80s cartoons there.
So until then, thank you for listening, and good night out there.
Whatever you are.